When I see film photography, the first thing that stands out is not the grain. Sure, that may be an indicator that it's a photo captured on film, and it certainly could add texture and a bit of character or grit to an image, but it's not a defining quality in my opinion. And that's what's so interesting about the film grain feature added to the Nikon Zf in the latest firmware update. While it is significant, it's only part of the equation for what I think we're looking for when creating digital images that look like film, or a better way to put it, vintage or retro photos. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Chris Hagan, a video producer and photographer in Portland, Oregon, and I think there's a key missing ingredient to creating straight out of camera images that have less of a digital look. But as we're going to break down in this video, when it all comes together with the right Nikon Imaging Recipe and the film grain update, then we start to get somewhere. So briefly, if you don't know about Nikon's imaging recipes, I'll catch you up, but I did do a full video on that you should probably check out too. Through the Nikon NX Studio software, you can create custom recipes to apply to JPEG straight out of camera. And these recipes are available for the Z52, Z5 II, ZF, Z6 III, and recently the Z8 as well. The customization runs as deep as you could ask for. Basic adjustments to highlights and shadows and all that, RGB tone curves, all kinds of color grading options with the ability to adjust hue, saturation, and luminance to individual colors, and a whole lot more. And the results from the recipes have been awesome, mainly thanks to the creator community that's put in a lot of unpaid work to provide some unique looks. Anyway, now that adding film grain in camera to these recipes is an option, it feels like we're that much closer to getting a finished look with a little more authenticity straight out of the camera. Film grain applied in camera, which is exclusive to the ZF right now, is implemented in an intuitive way that makes sense and gives the choice of adding subtle touches of grain, or if it's your style, just going all in and totally muddying up the frame. We've got 3 options of grain size: small, medium, and large, and you can apply that grain at 6 different levels of intensity, 1 being the least intense and 6 being the most. It's also well thought out to have the grain applied separately from the imaging recipe, since the recipes, by way of the flexible color profile, need to be adjusted on a computer. It's nice not to have to do that every single time you want to make changes to how the grain is applied. This is also where I'd be remiss if I didn't make at least a little bit of a comparison to Fujifilm. With that system, your choices are just small or large in terms of grain size, and strong or weak in terms of intensity. And to my knowledge, both Nikon and Fujifilm apply the grain differently with each shutter press. So it's not exactly the same grain in the same place on each image, if that makes sense. Looking at the numbers, yes, Nikon technically gives you more options in terms of how the film grain is applied, but as I'll show you here, and as plenty of others have pointed out, the grain becomes a bit too much with anything past level 4 in terms of intensity, especially in color. Black and white photos with the in-camera grain actually feel very natural, and just using the monochrome options in camera, I don't think I'd change a thing. But for color images, it's just a really fine line to walk. Sometimes medium-sized grain with the intensity set to 3 was fine. Other times, it was just too much. So my settings are typically medium-sized grain with the intensity set to 2. I don't really want the grain to be the first thing you notice. I'd love for the composition, lighting, and color to direct the image, and then just have the grain kind of bring it home. That's how I rolled most of Halloween week, and I had one of those real-life moments you just wish you had a video camera rolling for. I was taking some of the photos on Halloween night straight out of camera and sending them to my wife so she could post on social media because, of course, and she says, no lie, "Wow, these aren't edited?" At that point, I knew I'd arrived. I knew I had my updated recipe dialed in, and the film grain gave it the finishing touch that a lot of my edits have too. But something was still missing, or a better way to put it, something was still there. The sharpness, contrast, and clarity that make mirrorless cameras and modern lenses so optically clean still left the straight out of camera images a little more on the clinical side. So what's the missing link here? The lens, the most obvious thing that's literally right in front of our face and often overlooked when trying to create retro or film style digital photos. We look at Nikon and Fujifilm recipes that reduce clarity and contrast and add grain, or we turn to film presets that can go even further in terms of giving it that retro look. The film presets I use a lot, linked below, have tools to simulate light leaks, different lab scans, and even dust. But all of that adds steps to the process, taking your image from the camera to the phone or computer, and then getting them processed and exported back wherever they need to go. To the crowd that truly wants a straight out of camera vintage look, you need to actually add something physically vintage to the digital process. A vintage lens. I went to Blue Moon Camera here in Portland and picked up a nikkor-h 50mm f2 lens. They presented a few copies of it, and I opted for one that was a bit older, from the 1960s, and it absolutely delivers what I was looking for. The images straight out of camera, especially shooting wide open, have a soft look reminiscent of older photos that were captured with lenses that don't have the ultra sharp modern optics that we see today. It's especially noticeable when shooting toward bright light, like the sun, which really reduces contrast without some of the coatings available on newer lenses. Shooting like this, it's definitely a choice, to say the least. You got to know what you're signing up for in terms of optics and how you shoot. It's not going to be the sharpest image or have as much contrast as you may be used to all the time, especially, like I said, shooting wide open. Also, this is a manual focus only lens on a dumb adapter without electrical contacts that doesn't communicate with the camera. All of your adjustments to the aperture and focus are done on the lens. And if you want EXIF data accurately recorded to the image, you'll need to set that up in the menu and make changes as you shoot. For example, if I adjusted the lens to f2.8, I need to adjust the camera settings separately for it to record that the image was captured with that 2.8 aperture. Otherwise, the camera has no way of knowing what aperture you were actually shooting at, and it'll just record whatever it was set to last. But again, this is only relevant if you want that information accurately recorded. The point here is, if you're after a vintage image and experience, a vintage lens is the way to go. And it helps to have a good recipe to go along with it, whether it's black and white or color. Since the original video I did about Nikon recipes during the summer, I updated my own PDX Portra, and you can download version 2 from the link in the description. I think the original is good for really high contrast or bright scenes, but the update adds just a little more contrast and punch, and I really like the photos that I made with it during peak fall season here in Portland. Also, you really need to check out Dennis Securi's imaging recipes. He's got a Facebook group and Instagram page dedicated to sharing them, and they are all fantastic. He actually asked me to test one of his latest recipes out before releasing it, and I loved it, especially paired with older glass. The vintage 50mm just adds even more real character to the photos. To me, in my eyes, this 60-year-old 50mm prime gives the image a unique look that you just can't quite replicate with a JPEG recipe or preset alone. Although, the way that Nikon's 40mm f2 renders, it's also got a ton of character. And look, I'm not trying to wax poetic just because I took some less sharpened photos with a vintage lens, nor am I trying to push the idea that the film-like or retro look means the photo has to lack contrast and sharpness. There are pros and cons to it, and reasons why modern lenses cost what they do and perform how they do as well. Shots like this on the Nikon Z 50mm f1.8s lens, maintaining the contrast and color in an extremely backlit scene are possible because of the improved technology in photography. Older lenses that were meant for film can also struggle to resolve modern sensors, which means some of those details you might retain when cropping into a photo captured with a modern lens may not be there with an older piece of glass. Also, shooting wide open at f2 with a manual focus lens, not easy. I missed focus on more than a few shots, and it really made me appreciate modern autofocus all over again. Being able to nail focus on eyes at f1.4 is actually kind of crazy, and I think we often take it for granted. But in a world where most of the latest and greatest lenses that come out prioritize being optically perfect, being able to add some natural, unique character to the image with the lens goes a long way, and I think that is what will give your digital photos more of a vintage look than anything else. Let me say this too. No matter what you're shooting on, vintage or not, one thing you do want that's modern is memory cards. I make sure to update mine on a regular basis, especially when there are sales floating around. OWC is always the first place I check, mainly because they're so competitively priced and reliable. I use their CF Express Type A and B cards and SD cards to capture photos like this. So, my thoughts on film grain in the ZF? It's a great addition to the toolbox, and it really helps add a nice finishing touch. Grain alone, in my opinion, doesn't change the game or make the photos more film-like, but it works well in combination with everything else we talked about in this video. Many of the images I've made, whether they were with the vintage 50mm or Surei's 35mm f1.4 or Nikon's 40mm f2, feel more complete. But on a grander scale, the addition of film grain to the ZF says a lot about Nikon as a brand. When this camera was released in 2023, we got a retro body, which does matter clearly to lots of people who love this camera. And inside of it, we got a spectacular full-frame sensor and processor. Then, in spring 2025, a year and a half after its release, Nikon updated the firmware, not just adding support for the imaging recipes and cloud support as well, but also addressing how auto ISO works and making it more user-friendly in addition to a few other things. And then months later, we get film grain applied in camera, which so many people are asking for. And it comes on a camera that's now more than 2 years old. It would not have surprised me if it never came, or if it didn't come until there's a ZF Mark II, if there's even such a thing in the pipeline. There are other brands that are not quite as generous with their firmware updates and instead release cameras within a year of each other and update one, but not the other. It says a lot that Nikon listens to creators and then goes to the engineers or developers or whoever and says, let's do this. Let's go all the way and finish what we started with the ZF. And they've done this with features they've added and firmware improvements they've made with the Z9 and Z8 and Z6 III and more. All that to say, in a camera landscape where people flood Facebook groups and forums with questions of, should I buy camera A or should I wait until camera A Mark II is released, Nikon gives us a little more confidence that they're not abandoning their customers and just pushing on to what's next. And that's a quality worth considering when buying into any system. Guys, this was a really fun video to bring you. Let me know what you think about the film grain update and if you have any questions. Also, now that I've opened this Pandora's box into vintage lenses, please help me spend more money on them. If you have suggestions for some good ones, I'd love to know. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll see you again soon.